That's a safety life cycle drawing from 61508. As you can see, it's a bespoke system. It goes all the way from scope definition to decommissioning. It's really meant to be an entire life cycle. And one of the reasons many members of the committee were so adamant is because they found many cases where designs were done really cleanly and operation, maintenance, and repair was done very poorly. I have many stories. I won't ask you. You probably have some too, but I can mention them without names. There's 3 phases: analysis, realization, and operation. No matter how they draw it, there's typically 3 phases. This is the drawing from 61511, and it looks different, but there's still analysis, realization, and operation. Figure out how much safety you need, write it down, and give that information to the designers. The designers figure out what they're going to do and do it. Factory acceptance test, installation, commissioning, validation, operation, maintenance, and then modification and decommissioning. What do you do in analysis? Figure out how much safety you need. Then you're going to figure out how to do it and how to do it with optimal design, considering everything, including cost. You're not here to design the world's most expensive. You're designing to match the risk reduction requirements. And that's important. This probabilistic approach allows you to design and spend the proper amount of money to match a given risk level, at least to an order of magnitude. Many of the prior prescriptive approaches wasted a lot of money. Lastly, how do you keep it safe? This is really important. Here's a more detailed picture of what goes on, and you can almost imagine it now, having gone through a little bit of an example. What can go wrong? How bad is it? Any protection layers or mitigation factors? How often will it happen? And you do all that and you figure out, how does it compare to tolerable risk? Do we even need a safety function? And sometimes the answer is no. We'll design other risk reduction facilities. If we do want an EEPE safety function, we select the risk reduction factor, the target SIL level for each safety function, each. They're not all the same. Some hazards are worse than others. And we can design to match the risk with an optimal amount of money spent and make trade-offs between proof testing, between capital cost and life cycle cost. You can make those trade-offs with a probabilistic approach and develop the specification to give to the designers. We're not going to teach you all this stuff, but the purpose here is to say, what do people do at the systems level? Now, in the realization phase, I'm given a specification. Here are the safety functions. Here are the risk reduction factors, or the SIL levels required. I know what it has to do, and I know how good it has to be. So now I can pick equipment that matches, or if I have a common logic solver, it's kind of highest SIL level wins because it's being used by all the safety functions, which is normal. Select the equipment. Do I need redundancy or not? You're not required necessarily except for SIL 3, but I'll get into that later. Figure out how you're going to test it. Can you even do proof testing? And if you want to do proof testing with the process running, you're going to have to design some way of doing that. You know, bypass valves, whatever methods of testing the sensor. Many that I know test it while the process is down during a shutdown. But if you're not going to shut down for years, then you have to design to run for years and achieve the safety. Up here, we consider cost, we consider risk, we match. Down here, we check and make sure that what we've designed meets the risk reduction requirements. And if it doesn't, go through the loop again and iterate. Well, maybe I need some better equipment. Maybe I better do more proof testing. Whatever the choice is, change the design or the procedures until you meet risk reduction factors. Then proceed with the detailed designs using the manufacturer's safety manual and any application standards. The most important thing is this SIF verification task. And I wanted to mention the concept of, we've taken all the requirements and conceptually boiled them down to just 3. For every piece of equipment you buy, there is the concept of a systematic capability. Is this design even good enough to consider for SIL 3? Maybe the design's not so good and it's only good for a SIL 2. If the product is certified, there should be a systematic capability rating right on the certificate. And it means you can't really use it in a SIL level higher than that unless you do some very special things. There is one exception clause, but for diverse redundancy. But systematic capability is a measure of design quality. And I'll show you exactly how it comes about. There is a section called architecture constraints. There are limits. In the new version, 2016 61511, and in the what's called Route 2H of 61508, you must have redundancy for SIL 3. No choice, sorry, you don't get to choose for now, except there is one exception again, but it's all very logical. If you understand it, I find it all very logical and consistent. So you check this, and then you do your calculations. One of the reasons I emphasize this is in the earliest version of the ISA 8401, these two didn't exist. It was only number 3. And there are some companies still operating that way. They don't check. Now, systematic capability can be established by a company. You may use your own criteria for that based on your own experience. That's called prior use. The key is document it, justify it, and document the justification. You're allowed at 61511. So we'll think about these 3 barriers. Systematic capability. It is a measure of design quality as measured by sets of tables in 61508. I'll explain it in more detail as we go. It's a concept that's been around, but only the term was only defined, to my knowledge, in the 2010 version of the standard. Previously, people were using words like SIL systematic or process SIL, or things like that, or SIL capability, and the new term. I love having a term that's now defined for everyone to use consistently. The fact is, prior justification can be used, but it's getting to the point where there's so many products that are certified of all different types that most people, like that example I gave you, all the parts that they've chosen were certified. Besides, you don't have to take any responsibility for justification. And a lot of engineers do not wish to do that. Manufacturer certificates, however, should be giving you some important pieces of information. Systematic capability, failure rate data, architecture constraint type, and that's an A or a B, and I'll talk about those later, and a statement of compliance. Architecture constraints, what is that? I could give you the entire history of that because it was long and controversial, but you don't care about the history, or it doesn't really matter. The bottom line is, in the old version of 61511, in the old version of 61508, and in the new version, there are minimum levels of redundancy as a function of some variables. 61508 has two approaches. There's a metric called safe failure fraction called route 1H, and you calculate this metric, and then that tells you how much redundancy you need. Alternatively, you can use route 2H if your failure rate data quality can be demonstrated. And so just to be very clear, the architecture constraints were created by a number of committee members who felt the probabilistic approach was not sufficient, and they wanted some extra protection. In 61508, they use the word hardware fault tolerance to mean levels of redundancy. Now, it's a little weird. It's like an elevator in Europe where 0 is really the first floor for us. And the first floor is really our second floor. Well, hardware fault tolerance 0 means we have one set of equipment. Hardware fault tolerance of 1 means we have two sets of equipment. So I just think European elevators. Although in our hotel, the one's gone now. It just says L for lobby. And anyway, two sets of equipment are used in the sensors. Either one can tell me if the pressure goes too high. That's an HFT equals 1. As long as the PLC is programmed to trip if either one says to trip. We can also program it to do the opposite, in which case HFT is no longer 1. IEC 61508, and I'm going to explain this metric because it was a big part of the standard early on, defined a metric called safe failure fraction. Now, it's defined as the ratio of all safe failures plus dangerous detected divided by the total. And so if there are no dangerous undetected failures, none, your safe failure fraction is 100%, or 1. If there's a whole lot of dangerous undetected failure, your safe failure fraction drops. 61508 did define A and B components. Now, this is very logical. A has these characteristics. We understand how it fails. We understand the failure rates. The behavior is completely determined. There is sufficient dependable failure rate data. In other words, for an A, we have a strong case to depend on this failure rate data. What about B? Well, this is an exida definition, not the standard definition. Everything else, like a microprocessor. Why is a microprocessor in type B? And by the time you ever have a chance of collecting enough failure rate data, it'll be obsolete, off the market, and replaced with a new one. So it's a type B. So just remember those definitions. Here's the chart. You got a safe failure fraction. Depending on how good the safe failure fraction is, depending on your SIL level, you need a certain level of hardware fault tolerance. For type A, now take a look at this, SIL 1. For type B, everything gets shifted one SIL level because there's so much unknown. We just want you to do an order of magnitude better. And that kind of there's some logic in that. The problem is this safe failure fraction itself and the requirements. For hardware fault tolerance of 2, you have to put in 3 pressure transmitters and trip if any one of the 3, and you've just tripled the safe failure rate compared to a single unit, and it pushes people towards much higher safe failures in a system level. And that's really no good. You may know why, but I went into a chemical plant where they were making some unbelievably nasty stuff years ago. And they said, here's our safety system. And they opened the rack up. Oh, nice. There's the screw terminals. And what's that black wire for? It didn't really work right from the day it was installed. Every spring and every fall we get a trip. So we put that black wire in and we haven't had a trip since. You know what they did? They bypassed the whole damn safety function. They fixed the problem, and that's exactly what's going to happen. If in my opinion, you must also design for low false trip rates. And sometimes a trip is a dangerous situation. I mean, so the problem with this is these charts tend to push people toward designs with a higher than optimal false trip rate. Route 1H. In the 2010 version of the standard, an alternative was put in. It said failure rates are based on a method. If failure rates are based on a method that gives a 90% confidence in the results, and that's Exida's language, this isn't a quote. No safe failure fraction is calculated, and minimum hardware fault tolerance tables is determined by a set of rules. And for Route 2H, how do you get data that you have confidence in? It doesn't specifically state this, but many of us believe that 90% confidence is more than a statistical analysis. It's more than an uncertainty factor. A high-quality data collection system is required also. However, Exida has audited dozens of manufacturers' data collection systems, and I find that many of them are seriously flawed, and the data does not generate confidence. That's the chart that you could derive from the rules listed in the standard, but to be clear, this particular chart is not in 61508. They have words that describe it, and if you read the words and you build your own chart, you should get this. You will get this. Now, one of the reasons I say the safe failure fraction metric is dead in the new process industry standard, they've replaced the old charts with just a copy of this, period. That's it. No safe failure fraction, no. However, there's several sentences here and there that talk about the need for high quality field failure-based failure data. I read those sections and I thought, how could I write this better? And you know, I could not come up with better wording than that's already in the standard. So 61508, which is our focus, does give you an alternative if you have good failure rate data. Now, calculations. They have everything to do with a number of variables. 61508 and the family of standards that go with it go all the way to decommissioning, which is good because this may be the most important phase of the entire safety life cycle. A really well-designed system will fail more frequently with bad maintenance practices. What I just said was failure rates change from site to site. That is the safety life cycle in a more detailed way with the process industry examples. there is a chart, there is a column on the left-hand side of that chart in 61511, and an identical column in 61508 that talks about functional safety management. And basically there are a set of requirements that states you must have a written, documented procedure. Someone must be checking to see if people are following the procedure. And there's a whole long list of stuff that popped right out of my basic quality training from 1970. It hasn't changed. You do it, you say you do, somebody checks to see you're doing what you say you're going to be doing. It specifies the activities of those responsible. In other words, if Jerry is responsible, we have to make sure we tell him he's responsible. I mean, this stuff's very common sense, but it's in 61508, and I don't see it as anything that's strange or weird. And there is a competency requirement for personnel with little to say how you judge competency. So each company sets up their own methodology. The objectives here are simply to make sure we have defined our engineering process and we are following it. There's some details here which we'll get in. Most companies already have a good quality system in place, and we find in most of our auditing that it's only a matter of adding a few statements to it. There are documentation requirements in 61508, of course. And as one who loves solving engineering problems but hates documentation, I cringe to a certain extent, but you know, I'm old now. Over the years I've learned this stuff has got to be documented. Older you get, the less you remember. At least I'll speak for myself. So I learned we document what needs to be documented. Everything to perform each phase, everything that says we've checked to make sure that people are following the process, all verification and validation activities, the documents that say we checked and the documents that say we tested, and then functional safety assessments, which are often, for products, they're done by the third-party certification bodies commonly. There are personnel competency requirements in all of the standards, and you can read this, and it's kind of common sense. Hey, if you're doing something, you have to know what you're doing. That's all I read in all that. Evaluate training, knowledge, experience, and qualifications. Okay, that's all total common sense. That appears to me to be the same stuff I learned in my quality training in the early 80s. Exida actually created a personnel certification scheme. We call it the Certified Functional Safety Engineer or expert, and there's different levels, and if you want to read about it, you can go on that website. But we did it because many companies, including our own, needed more help. And there's applications level for process, machinery, automotive. There's hardware developers, software developers, and cybersecurity. This particular course would set someone up for hardware or software development exam. If you're interested, I only mention it because it helps people, and at the moment, no other agency is cooperating in the CFSE program. There's three levels. There's FSP, CFSP. FSP is not operated per 17024. It's just a simple exam at the end of a course, and if you pass, you get a certificate. Anyway, let me just run through this briefly because this is fun stuff. I just wanted to ask, does system architecture affect SIL analysis? And what we meant by this term is redundancy. And yes, it changes the hardware fault tolerance, but even far more importantly, it has a major impact on the PFD calculation when you take into account the redundancy, which is exactly what you'd expect. The three major phases: analysis, realization, and operation. Why should safety requirements be generated during the analysis phase? Because those who do the risk analysis must communicate their needs to those who do the design. All right. You have seen a systems level design, safety life cycle, and some of the issues in 61508 and how they're being improved rapidly, and I'm very pleased about them.